Hi, everyone. I'm so glad that you could join us today for this special New York Times for Kids event. I'm Amber Williams. I'm the editor of the New York Times for Kids, and I hope that many of you have actually seen the section. It's a special print section that runs in the paper on the last Sunday of every month, and it's made just for you. Adults aren't even supposed to look at it, okay? Just for you. So if you haven't been able to see it, I actually have a section here. This is our March issue. It was actually the dogs and cats issue. So every single story is about dogs or cats. This one you can see is a cat cover. And for instance, we had this one story about how cats are entirely misunderstood. They may seem grumpy and rude, but they actually really love you and just have, not great ways of showing it sometimes. And then if you flipped it over, we actually had a dog's cover. You can see him. And all of the stories on this side were about dogs. For instance, why they have such an incredible sense of smell. And it turns out they actually have 3D smell, which is really cool. So that was a special themed issue, which we do a few times a year, but our more regular monthly issues, are obviously dedicated to the news and what's happening in the world around us. So it'll be no surprise to anyone here that the April issue, which actually comes out on Sunday, is dedicated to the coronavirus and how, it's affecting all of our lives. So for instance, on the science page, we asked many of our readers to send in questions that they had about the coronavirus, and we received over 40 responses. We then chose a handful to answer in our print edition that comes out on Sunday. And that's what we're going to continue to do here today, is to answer your health and science questions about the coronavirus. So joining me and to help me do that, to answer your questions, I have two guests. The first is Dr. Jeanne Marrazzo, and she's an expert in infectious diseases at the University of Alabama. And then we also have Apoorva Mandavilli, who is a science journalist at the New York Times and has been covering extensively the coronavirus and how it's been affecting all of us. So welcome, Apoorva and Dr. Marrazzo. Thanks for joining me here today.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to be here. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
So the first thing we're actually going to do is to turn to 4 kids who have already submitted questions and are here with us today. First things first, though, I want you all to know that you should submit your own questions below in the Q&A function in Zoom. So if you see that button below that says Q&A, click on it and please type in your questions. Please include your name and your age and where you're listening from. And no one else will be able to see those questions, but they'll come to me so that I can ask them later to Apoorva and Dr. Marrazzo. One bookkeeping note is that this event is being recorded, and your questions may appear in a future print edition of the New York Times for Kids. So please do submit those questions because I'll be keeping them for myself and to maybe use in a future edition. So we're first going to turn to Rishaan, and Rishaan is in Massachusetts, and he has our first question.
My question was, how is coronavirus spreading so rapidly?
Sure, I can take a stab at answering that. Thanks, Rishaan. That is the million-dollar question that's on everybody's minds. And I would say there are 3 big reasons. First of all, it is incredibly easy to spread on surfaces. So once it gets on a surface like a table or your bedpost or a rail, a guardrail or a handrail, it can stay there for a long time, sometimes up to 3 days. Not only that, we've been thinking about it like glitter. So you remember if you've ever had a party or anything like that, glitter hangs around forever. That's how good it is in getting into all these little nooks and crannies. So it's a very good virus to get around. The second part is that people transmit it and can give it to other people even before they get sick. So you can be around somebody who seems perfectly healthy And unfortunately, they might be in the early stages of infection and they might sneeze and you might get the virus that way. And then the third reason is, which is a really important one if you're interested in biology and animals, it's because that we have never seen this virus in humans before. And I'm going to bring out my little props right now, so I'm sure you know what this is. Bats are really interesting. Bats have a lot of coronaviruses, and they do fine with them. They live like totally healthy with them, until those viruses get into another species. And I don't know if you know this, but there's a special species that has been implicated in this particular virus called the pangolin. I know that looks kind of like a bear, but it's really supposed to be a pangolin. It has all these scales. And so the virus goes from one host where it lives fine and doesn't really cause any problems, jumps into another animal. And then when we disturb that animal's home, like go into the forest, chop the trees down, whatever, and maybe bring those animals home as pets where they really don't want to be pets, we can get exposed to those kinds of viruses. And if we as humans have never seen them before, our bodies don't know what to do, and it can really cause problems. And that's probably the third reason that this has gone so fast in our people.
Thanks, Rishaan. That was a great question. Next up, we're heading to Penny in Brooklyn. Hi, Penny.
Hi, this is my little sister Alice. She's going to help me ask my questions today. My first question is, why is this virus more dangerous than other viruses?
Why do kids not get the virus?
Okay, I can answer that, and I'll take Alice's question first. Why do kids not get it? Actually, kids can get it. We know now that kids do get the virus, but luckily, kids, when they get the virus, don't get very sick. They get a very mild infection, so almost like a cold. And sometimes kids might be sick and not even know that they have the virus. So you heard Dr. Marrazzo say people can pass it on even when they don't know that they have it, even before they're sick. The same thing might be true for kids. So it's really important that you wash your hands even if you don't feel sick. The other question, why is this so dangerous? That also goes back to something Dr. Marrazzo said about how we've never seen this before. So if you think of other things that you've probably got shots for, like measles or chickenpox, those are viruses too. But we've had time to figure out how to fight those things. We've had time to figure out how to make a vaccine so we don't get it. But this is a brand new virus and we don't really know a lot about it. So we're all scrambling. There are a lot of very smart scientists trying to figure out how to make a vaccine as fast as possible. But in the meantime, when older people get it, they can get very, very sick and end up in the hospital. And that makes this pretty dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Penny and Alice. Our third question comes from Madeline, and she's in Pennsylvania. Hi, Madeline.
Hi, my question is, will there be a cure for the coronavirus, and are we close to finding it?
Hi, Madeline. That is a great question. And Apoorva already mentioned that a lot of people are very, very, very busily working on this question. So I would think about it in two ways. Sometimes we can develop medicines to treat these infections. Viruses are actually kind of hard to develop medicines for. It's not like some other things that cause infections, like strep throat, which is a bacteria, and you may have had that. You just take an antibiotic and it goes away. Viruses are a little bit more challenging to treat, but we do have a drug that we are going to be finding out very soon if it actually works. And we're probably going to then look at several other drugs. So the medicine part is really good. The only way you can cure most viruses is either you become immune to them as a person, which means your body develops protection against it, or you get a vaccine that makes your body develop that protection, and that's with something called antibodies. We are very close to testing a vaccine against this virus in a large number of people, and we hope that we'll have a vaccine probably in about 1.5 years. So that gives us something to look forward to.
Dr. Marrazzo, can I ask, why does it take so long? Why is it 1 year to develop a vaccine?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, vaccines are powerful, but you have to be very careful to make sure that they are safe. Mm-hmm. Most of the time, they're really safe, but when you are putting something in a human person for the very first time, you want to do it in a healthy person who you think won't be harmed at all if there are any problems with the vaccine. So you start out studying it in a small group of healthy people, and you're not going to really know whether it works from that small group. Once you know it's safe, then you test it on a whole bunch of people and you can get a better sense of going forward. So that process takes time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, lastly, from our 4 participants here, we are now turning to Frida, who's in Los Angeles. Hi, Frida, what's your question?
Hi, my question is, when will everything go back to normal?
Okay, well, that's a really, really tough question to answer. And there are a lot of very smart people trying to figure that out. I think what I can tell you is that it's really important right now that we keep doing what we've been doing, which is staying home from school, not having play dates with our friends. I know that's really, really hard to do, but it's very important that we keep doing that. And if we keep doing that for another few weeks, hopefully by the summer, we can get back to doing some of the things that we love to do.
Great. Okay, so next, I'm going to turn to some of the questions that have been submitted. And I want to remind you, if you haven't already typed in a question, to please go into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and type in your question. Please put your name and your age and where you're listening from. And I'm going to start reading some of them out. And Apoorva and Dr. Marrazzo are going to answer them. So Eric, he asks a little more about, we talk about, again, how did it start? So maybe Dr. Marrazzo, you can talk again about a little more about the animals and kind of like how this became such a big thing.
Right, so good question. The very first time that we saw this infection was in China. And it was in a city that, like many cities in China, had a very big market that sold not only seafood and vegetables, but also a fair amount of animals. And some of them were live animals. Some of them were animals that were being used for food. And the thinking is that it created an environment where that transfer of that virus from different animal species became very, very easy. And so people who were around all those animals in a very close setting, it was actually cold, it was winter, so people were in a very close setting, which means that when somebody sneezes or somebody puts their hands on something, there's a lot of opportunity for that virus to get moved around from person to person. So the thinking is the very first cases were people who worked in that market. And those were people who were probably exposed or had a lot of virus around them for a long time. So that's kind of where people think the virus came from. It then spread out as people went home, they went out to other restaurants, they went out to other businesses. It's sort of like a radiation of virus cases out throughout the society around there. So that's what we think happened.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That was a great question. We have another one from Akash 10. He asks, how long can the coronavirus survive on its own?
Okay, well, that depends on what the coronavirus is on. It depends on the surfaces. We know, for example, that on certain materials like plastic, it can last up to 3 days, as Dr. Marrazzo said. But if it's something like cardboard, it probably lasts only about a day. If you just are taking a walk out in the air, outside, you're going for a walk or a run and you happen to be sick and you breathe out the virus, it probably doesn't last very long because there's so much air out there that any virus that you breathe out is immediately going to be diluted in all of the air that's out there. So it really depends on which materials you're talking about. But it's also important to know that the virus doesn't really multiply on its own. It really needs a person. It needs to get inside a person to make more copies of itself. So it's a little bit more complicated than, the virus on its own doesn't really get very far. So it needs us as people to help it to multiply.
Mm-hmm. And that's why we all have to wash our hands so often whenever we touch something or go out, right? And not touch my face like I almost did. Because soap can actually, disrupt the virus, get it off your hands, and then you'll be safe.
That's right.
Let's see. While we were talking about animals, Carmen, who's 8 and from Birmingham, Alabama, said, "Can I give coronavirus to my pets? And if I do, will they get sick?"
Well, I answered that one because I'm also from Birmingham, Alabama. So hi, Carmen. Nice to hear you asking questions on this session. You know, there was some concern about this early on, and maybe you heard that story of the tiger in the Bronx Zoo who actually got infected. I think the tiger has recovered and has done well because I haven't heard any more about it. So coronaviruses as a family can definitely infect animals. So we already talked about, you know, the pangolins, we talked about the bats, and some of them can infect all kinds of animals. This one does not seem to cause real problems or common infections in the animals that we typically have in our homes, like cats and dogs. There have been some people who've observed that you can have infections in those animals, but it doesn't look anywhere near like that's going to be a problem either for the animals themselves and our pets or for the people who keep them. So I think that's one less thing you need to worry about, thank goodness.
Good. Anna, who is 5 and lives in New York, she asked a great question. Why is it that we can stay close to our parents, but not our friends?
Apoorva, you want me to start that? You want to take that one?
I think you should take that one as the infectious disease expert.
That's a great question, right? Because you're close to your parents, you're close to people you're living with, and nobody ever said you all got to stay in different bedrooms, right? And you can only like talk to each other across a screen or something like that. That's because people generally assume that if you've been living with those people for a while, like you have with your parents, you've probably been pretty much sharing everything you're going to share right now, right? You're breathing the same air, you're touching the same surfaces, you're eating the same food. Your parents are helping you out with your schoolwork or with your laundry, or you're doing stuff for them. So the thinking is that whatever happens has already happened. So you don't need to add further stress to everything that's going on by thinking about being separated from the people in your household already. That's why when you go outside and you see people who go out as families, they're not doing social distancing, right? They're sort of often clustered together as a group, which is great. It's nice to see that because it reminds us that we will be able to get back to that state soon, we hope.
Mm-hmm. On that note, Penny, 8 from New Jersey, asked, why do we have to stay 6 feet or more away from each other?
So that recommendation of 6 feet is based on studies of how the virus moves through the air. Scientists did some experiments to figure out how fast does the virus move, how does it move through space and through air, and they came up with a number, and actually 6 feet is twice that number. It's actually 3 feet originally, but these things can also change with the wind direction and how fast the wind is moving and things like that. So 6 feet is a good recommendation, but the farther apart you can be, the safer it is.
Mm-hmm. Charlotte from New Paltz and is 8 years old. She asks, how did it spread to different continents?
Wow, I can take that one. So I'm from India. My parents live in India, and my family loves to travel, and maybe yours does too. So think about how many people are on airplanes every single day going back and forth. This is a very connected world that we live in, and there are people traveling all over the place, tens of thousands of people going from China, where it began, to New York, to Los Angeles, to places in Europe. And so once somebody's infected, as we know, as Dr. Marrazzo said, this virus is very tricky and it can really spread quite easily. And so it was only a matter of time once it started in China for it to get all over the world.
Mm-hmm. Jonah from New York asks, how do people examine the virus? How is a diagnosis made that you have it?
Boy, that's a great question. And we wish we could do it a lot more often. One of the big challenges with this pandemic, which is basically, that means that it's an infection that affects the whole world, right, is that we haven't been able to diagnose it as much as we would like to. In a perfect world, we would have, if you came in and you didn't feel good, you had a runny nose or fever, we would take a swab that's a little bit like a long Q-tip swab, and you put it in your nose and you sort of go back to about here. So you really get a long sample of the lining of your nose where it goes back down and actually meets your throat, sort of, and then your throat goes down here, and that's called your nasopharynx. So it's a nasopharynx swab. You take that and then you send it to the lab, and they actually look for the genes of the virus. So basically a genetic test. So it's a molecular test that looks for the virus. That's what we have been doing, and that works great. If you can get it, our challenge has been, and you may have heard this, we haven't had a lot of those tests. So some people have just been told they have the virus, even though they haven't gotten a test, because it looks like they have the virus. They have all the things that look like fever, trouble breathing, they might have a cough, they might have a sore muscles. So that's how we like to make the diagnosis if we can.
Mm-hmm. On that note, and from another guest from Alabama, Surrey, she asked, how is COVID treated in hospitals? So how are adults who get it, what does their treatment look like so far?
Sure, I can start with that. Most people who are admitted to the hospital right now are getting treated pretty much with just giving them oxygen, making sure that their fluid level is good. In other words, that they're drinking enough water and getting enough water, and their blood pressure is good, they're getting enough oxygen. And that gets back to that question about treatment. We don't have a treatment, i.e. a medicine right now, that we know everybody should get when they come into the hospital. There are some medicines that we can use, but we are using them carefully because we're not really sure that they work. So you can be comfortable knowing everybody's getting keep them as comfortable as possible, make sure they're breathing as comfortably as possible, make sure their fever stays down. And then there are some studies where I mentioned where we're actually doing some research to see if we can give people some of these newer medicines.
Mm-hmm.
And I can add to that just a little bit to say some of the medicines that we're testing are ones that have worked on other viruses.
Mm-hmm.
And in some cases, some of the people who are really, really sick, turns out they're sick because their immune system is almost fighting too hard. And so we're testing for some medicines that make the immune system calm down a little bit so that they can get better. So there's a lot of different things that people are trying to figure out which medicines work to help people.
Mm-hmm. On that note, Surrey had a follow-up question, which was about vaccines. And she asked, do you think the COVID-19 vaccine, when it becomes developed, will become a yearly vaccine like the flu vaccine?
That's a great question. And Apoorva, it looks like you want to comment too, but I'll just say that one of the hardest parts about doing a good job preventing this infection and thinking about the next year is that we still don't really know whether people who have had the infection get over it. Can they get it again? What about their body allows them to control the virus and then get back to normal? If we knew that, we could then take that and say, this is what we're going to make happen in people who've never had the virus. So the first thing we need to do is figure out what makes people able to get better, okay? And then in those people, does that stay for the next year or does it go away? Because one of the big questions with what we call immunity, which is what I'm talking about, is how long does it really last? Sometimes it lasts for years. So for example, you only need sort of one or a couple shots of measles and you're pretty much protected for the rest of your life. Other things you need to get vaccinated more than once for, like tetanus. You need to get a tetanus shot every 10 years or so. So we don't know how long people are actually protected against this virus. And that's going to be a huge question when we start thinking about how we're going to give people a vaccine once we figure out one that works.
Yeah, and I would just say to that also that once we know how long it lasts, that'll sort of decide how often we have to give it. If we know that it lasts for 3 years, then maybe you only need to have a vaccine every 3 years. Part of that is also, we need to figure out how much we can make of it. I mean, you've all gotten the flu vaccine, probably, I hope. And that you have to get every year because the flu virus changes a lot. And one of the lucky things about the coronavirus so far that we've seen is that it doesn't change very much. So hopefully if you get a vaccine 1 year and the immunity, as Dr. Marrazzo said, lasts a few years, then you may only need to get that vaccine once every few years and not have to get it every year.
All right, so here's the last question for the day. This is from Dylan, who's 11 and in New York City. And he wants to know, what should you do if a family member gets sick?
Yeah, that's been hard, and I'll start Apoorva. It's hard because, first of all, if a family member gets sick and they go to the hospital, it's been really hard to visit them because hospitals have really tried to keep the traffic of people down because they want to keep the number of people coming in and either bringing the virus in or getting it from the infected person low. So that has been a real challenge. If you get sick and you stay at home, you probably want to do something called quarantine yourself, which is basically put yourself in a room, if you have that, where you're away from the rest of your family so that you can at least try from that point on not to infect any of them. Okay, so and then they can bring you the meals that you need. They can make sure that they do the hand washing stuff that we talked about. So once you find out you're sick, trying to stay away from the people you think might still be able to get it is really important.
And if you're a kid, and if you've been around that person who's sick, maybe you have the virus too, and you just don't know it because, as we said before, kids, when they get the virus, are not really affected. So you should try and think about, if you were sick, how careful would you be, and try to be that careful. Wash your hands all the time. Don't touch your face. Try not to, get other people in the family sick. That's very important. You actually have the ability to protect other people.
You have the power.
You have the power.
Yes. Soap is a superhero in this situation.
Absolutely.
2 things before we say goodbye. One, those were wonderful questions, really great questions. And if you still have more questions or you want to suggest something that you want the New York Times for Kids to cover about coronavirus or about anything else that is happening in the world, definitely write them to me. And you can write to me at kids@newyorktimes.com. Just send me an email, kids@newyorktimes.com, and put your name and your age and whatever ideas or questions you have, and I'll definitely consider them for the next New York Times for Kids issue. And the second thing I want to say is that tomorrow we're actually holding another New York Times for Kids event at the same time, 3:30 Eastern. And that will be talking with kids about how they're dealing with quarantine and being stuck at home. So we'll hear from 2 kids about their own experiences and then their recommendations about how to get through it, as well as asking for your own tips and tricks, what you're reading, what you're listening to, what you're playing, to help us all get through this. So I hope that you'll join me again tomorrow. And if you go to timesevents.newyorktimes.com, that's where you can RSVP and get another Zoom link to join us. So thank you very much to Dr. Marrazzo and Apoorva for answering all your questions. And thank you for joining us. This has been really fun, and, a big thank you to our subscribers, which make these events possible. So have a great day, and hope to see some of you tomorrow again.
Thanks everybody.
Thanks for having
Stay
us.
healthy.
Bye.
Bye.
Yes.